They were a secret whispered only to the stars. On a cluster of worlds hidden by nebulae and stellar dust, the Leonis lived. They were a proud race. Tall, powerful beings with the aspects of ancient Terran lions. Golden manes framed noble, intelligent faces. Their forms were corded with muscle, honed by generations of life on their sun-drenched savanna worlds. They called themselves the children of the first roar. They were warriors, philosophers, and artisans. Their cities were marvels of graceful architecture, towers of white stone and gold that reached towards their twin suns. They lived in harmony with their worlds, a civilization built on honor and strength, unseen by the sprawling, chaotic realm of man. But they were not ignorant of humanity. For millennia they had watched. They had seen the rise of the Imperium. They had witnessed its endless wars. The Leonis held a deep, almost spiritual respect for mankind. They saw a reflection of their own fire in the human spirit. A stubborn refusal to be extinguished, a burning defiance against a hostile galaxy. From their hidden enclaves, they acted as silent guardians. They deflected Orc-Waz away from vulnerable colony worlds. They hunted down Tyranid scout organisms before they could summon a hive fleet. They sabotaged chaos rituals on dead moons. Their aid was never seen, never acknowledged. It was a gift given freely, with no expectation of thanks. The Leonis archives were vast libraries of data slates and crystal engrams. They contained more complete histories of the Imperium than many Adeptus Administratum vaults. They chronicled humanity's triumphs and its countless tragedies. The Leonis elders studied these histories with a heavy heart. They understood the Imperium's nature. They knew its fear of the alien, the mutant, the unknown. It was an empire built on suspicion and brutal pragmatism. This was why they remained hidden. To reveal themselves would be to invite judgment, to invite the very conflict they sought to prevent. So they remained shadows, their noble deeds lost to the uncaring void. Their society was built around a central tenet, the Great Vigil. This was the core of their philosophy. It dictated that true strength was not shown in conquest, but in protection. They believed their purpose was to shield the flickering flame of human civilization until it was strong enough to stand on its own. They saw the potential within humanity, a potential for greatness that even mankind had forgotten. They were the silent gardeners, tending a plant they could never claim to own. They asked for nothing in return. Their reward was the simple knowledge that humanity endured, another day, another year, another century, because of their silent, thankless sacrifice. The end began with a flicker. A single ship, an Imperial Navy Cobra-class destroyer lost and damaged, emerged from the Immaterium on the edge of Leonis space. It broadcast a weak distress call before its reactor failed. The signal was a death sentence. It was a beacon that pierced the Leonis' carefully constructed veil of secrecy. Weeks later, a Space Marine strike cruiser arrived. It was painted in the grim colors of the Iron Hands. They were not here to talk. They were not here to understand. They were here to answer a call from a lost ship in uncharted Xenos-held territory. Their mission was simple: purge the unknown. The first contact was brutal and swift. The Iron Hands saw not noble guardians, but monstrous aliens. They saw abominations, Xenos beasts that walked on two legs. Their bolters roared. The Leonis, for the first time in 1,000 years, were forced to defend their homes from those they had sworn to protect. They were powerful warriors. Their claws could shred ceramite. Their reflexes were lightning fast. They met the Space Marine assault with a ferocity that stunned the transhuman invaders. The initial landings were repulsed. The Iron Hands were forced back, leaving their dead on the golden fields of the world they had named Xenoprime. The Iron Hands did not retreat. They called for reinforcements. This was not just a purge, it was now a matter of pride. They had been challenged. They had been beaten. More ships arrived. Battle barges and cruisers, entire companies of Space Marines from different chapters, united in their duty to cleanse this new threat. The war began in earnest. Worlds that had known only peace for centuries became battlegrounds. The graceful Leonis cities were shelled into rubble. The sacred savannas were burned by orbital bombardment. The Leonis fought with the heart of their namesake, a desperate, valiant defense of everything they had ever known. But they were not the Imperium. They did not have a galaxy-spanning empire to draw troops from. They had only their handful of worlds. For every Space Marine they killed, 10 more seemed to take his place. For every tank they destroyed, 100 more landed. The Leonis saw the truth with chilling clarity. This was a war they could not win. The Imperium was a relentless grinding machine. It would not stop. It would not rest. It would throw legions and armies at them until their last world was dust and their last warrior was a corpse. The tragic irony was unbearable. They were being annihilated by the very people they had dedicated their existence to saving. In the heart of their last unconquered world, deep beneath the shell-shocked surface, the Leonis leadership convened. They were the oldest, the wisest, the strongest. They gathered in the Chamber of Echoes, a cavern where the history of their race was carved into the living rock. Their manes were singed, their armor was scarred, their faces were masks of grief and exhaustion. They were the Council of Last Roars, a name chosen for this final terrible meeting. The High Elder, a venerable Leonis named Kalen, stood before them. His voice, usually a powerful roar, was now a low, mournful rumble. He spoke of the unwinnable war. He laid out the stark reality. They could fight on. They could make the Imperium pay for every inch of ground in blood. They could rage against the dying of their light and take millions of humans with them. This would be the honorable path. The warrior's path. But it would achieve nothing. It would only weaken the Imperium further. It would drain resources and manpower that the galaxy-spanning empire desperately needed to fight chaos, to fight the orcs, to fight the Tyranids. Their final act of defiance would inadvertently help humanity's true enemies. It would be a betrayal of the Great Vigil. A younger chieftain, his fur still dark and his muscles taut, slammed a gauntleted fist on the stone table. He argued for vengeance. He spoke of the injustice, the sheer blind ignorance of the attackers. He demanded that they unleash their full might, that they show the Imperium the cost of its arrogance. Let their civilization be a pyre that burned so brightly it would be remembered for 10,000 years. Let their extinction be a curse upon the name of the Space Marines. Many of the younger warriors roared in agreement. The desire for retribution was a fire in their blood, a primal urge that was hard to deny, but Kalen raised a hand for silence. His old eyes were filled with a profound sadness. He spoke of their purpose. The Great Vigil was not about their own glory. It was not about their honor or their survival. It was about humanity's survival. That was the promise their ancestors had made to the stars. Now, at the very end, was the time to honor it most completely. He proposed the unthinkable, the final sacrifice. They would not allow themselves to be a drain on the Imperium's strength. They would not become another protracted war. They would end it themselves, on their own terms, for humanity's sake. A silence fell over the chamber, heavier than any mountain. The Leonis were not just warriors, they were masters of technology. Their understanding of physics far surpassed that of the Adeptus Mechanicus, even if they had not weaponized it for conquest. Now they turned that genius inward, for the purpose of total self-destruction. The first instruments were the Cobalt Valus warheads. These were not simple explosives. They were planetary sterilizers. Designed millennia ago as a last resort against a contagion they never faced, the bombs would release a cascade of hyper-radioactive particles into the atmosphere. They would not just kill, they would render a world utterly uninhabitable for 10,000 years, poisoning the very soil and water. The second method was kinetic. From hidden orbital platforms and deep space arrays, the Leonis controlled a network of mass drivers. These were originally used to move asteroids for mining. Now they were retargeted. The targets were their own cities, their own archives, their own holy sites. The platforms would accelerate tungsten rods the size of HAB blocks, to near light speed. Each impact would strike with the force of 1,000 nuclear bombs. There would be no rubble left, only craters miles wide and molten glass. It was a clean, brutal method of erasure, ensuring nothing of their culture, nothing of their history, would remain to be desecrated or misunderstood. The final piece was the Doomsday Machine. It was a name given to it by the young engineers who built it, a name filled with bitter irony. It was located at the core of their last planet, their homeworld of Leonis Prime. It was not a weapon, but a stellar ignition device, a machine designed to tap the geothermal energy of the planet and convert it into a focused beam. The original purpose was to one day reignite a dying star in a nearby system. Now its purpose was reversed. It would be overloaded, set to create a catastrophic feedback loop that would cause the planet's core to go critical. The resulting explosion would consume the entire world. The plan was meticulous and horrifying. The Cobalt Valus bombs would be detonated on their outer colony worlds first. This would create a dead zone, a wall of radiation that would halt the Imperial advance and give the Leonis time. Then, the kinetic strikes would begin, systematically obliterating every structure, every piece of infrastructure on their remaining worlds. Finally, as the Imperial fleet regrouped, confused by the sudden halt in fighting and the rising radiation signatures, the Doomsday Machine would be activated. One final silent act, the complete and total annihilation of their civilization, orchestrated by their own hands. It was the ultimate sacrifice, a self-inflicted genocide for the sake of their ignorant allies. Section 5. The First Reign of Sorrows. The command was given. A single encrypted signal broadcast from the Chamber of Echoes. Across a dozen worlds, the countdowns reached 0. On the planets already lost to the Imperial advance, where Space Marines were still hunting down pockets of resistance, the sky changed. It turned a sickening, brilliant blue. This was the signature of the Cobalt Valles warheads detonating high in the atmosphere. There was no fireball, no shockwave on the ground, just a silent, shimmering curtain of energy that spread across the heavens. The Space Marines paused their advance, looking up at the strange, beautiful, and deeply unsettling phenomenon. The effect was not immediate, but it was absolute. A rain began to fall, a fine glittering dust that coated everything. Within minutes, the Vox channels filled with frantic reports. Armor integrity was failing. Geiger counters screamed, going off the scale. Exposed flora and fauna withered and died, turning to black sludge before their eyes. The Space Marines, sealed in their power armor, were shielded for a time, but their war machines were not. Servitors collapsed. Vehicle engines sputtered and died as their electronics were fried by the intense radiation. The very air had become poison, a slow, inexorable death that no amount of bolter fire could stop. The Imperial forces were forced into a full-scale retreat. They scrambled back to their Thunderhawks and transports, abandoning their dead and their equipment. The worlds they had fought so hard to conquer were suddenly more deadly than any Xenos warrior. The Leonis had rendered them useless, but not just to the Imperium. They were useless to everyone. Cursed, poisoned chunks of rock that would be lethal for millennia. It was a scorched earth policy on a scale the Imperium had never witnessed. An act of self-mutilation that was utterly illogical. Why would a species poison its own nest? On the Imperial warships in orbit, the fleet commanders watched in stunned disbelief. Their augurs showed radiation levels that were impossible. They watched their ground forces flee in disarray from an enemy they could not see or fight. The Leonis resistance on these worlds had vanished. Not defeated, just gone. The Imperial strategists were baffled. This was not the act of a desperate enemy. It felt cold, calculated. It was a strategic denial of assets so total, so absolute, that it bordered on madness. The war had taken a turn into the unknown, and the Imperium did not know how to respond. The first phase of the Leonis' tragic plan was complete. On the remaining Leonis worlds, the final act began. The skies were filled not with enemy ships, but with streaks of fire of their own making. The kinetic bombardment had started. From orbit, the tungsten rods fell like tears from the gods. They struck the beautiful white cities, the grand libraries, the soaring temples. Each impact was silent in the void, but on the surface, it was apocalyptic. The ground shook with artificial earthquakes. Plumes of molten rock and dust were thrown miles into the atmosphere, blotting out the twin suns. The Leonis did not try to hide. They did not run. They gathered in the open fields, watching the destruction of their own heritage. They met their end with a quiet dignity. Families held each other. Elders chanted the old songs, their voices calm and steady even as the world came apart around them. Warriors laid down their weapons and knelt, facing the coming fire. There was no panic, no screaming, only a profound collective acceptance. They were the generation that would see the end of their history. They were the ones who would pay the final price of the Great Vigil. They were erasing themselves from the galaxy, not out of despair, but out of a love so deep it demanded their complete and utter destruction. It was an act of grace, a final terrible gift. Deep below the surface of Leonis Prime, in the control room for the Doomsday Machine, High Elder Kalen stood with his most trusted engineers. The surface of the planet was being systematically shattered by the kinetic rods. The Imperial fleet, now arrived in the system, watched in utter confusion, their weapons silent. They had come for a battle, but found a ritual suicide. Kalen watched the chronometers tick down. He thought of the long history of his people, the millennia of watching over mankind, the silent wars fought in the dark. It all ended here, in fire and silence. With a steady hand, he entered the final command sequence. He turned the key. The doomsday machine roared to life, not with the controlled hum it was designed for, but with a screaming, uncontrolled surge of power. The planet began to shudder violently. Kalen looked at his kin around him and they nodded. A gesture of shared purpose, a gesture of farewell. His last thought was a hope that one day, somehow, humanity would understand what was done for them on this day. Then the core of Leonis Prime breached. A wave of pure energy erupted outwards, and the world, along with everything and everyone on it, ceased to exist in a blinding flash of light. The Imperial fleet was thrown into chaos. The shockwave from the destruction of Leonis Prime was immense, a wave of energy and gravitational distortion that battered their void shields. Alarms blared across 100 bridges. Tech priests screamed prayers to the Omniscia as their consoles sparked and died. When the light faded, there was nothing left. Where a vibrant living world had been, there was now only an expanding cloud of incandescent gas and shattered rock. The Leonis homeworld was gone. The Imperial commanders stared at their tactical displays, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The entire Leonis star cluster fell silent. The Vox channels, which had been filled with the sounds of battle and then the thunder of the kinetic strikes, were now dead. There was no resistance, no transmissions, no life signs, nothing. The Space Marines and Imperial Guard legions had been prepared for a long, bloody campaign of extermination. Instead, they were left with a graveyard. A collection of dead worlds, some poisoned by radiation, others shattered and broken by orbital impacts. The enemy had simply vanished. They had committed suicide on a civilization-wide scale. Scout ships were sent in to survey the wreckage. They sent back picked captures and data streams that only deepened the mystery. They found the poisoned worlds, their surfaces glowing with lethal energy. They found the cratered worlds, where entire continents had been wiped clean, leaving nothing but glassy plains of fused silica. On the few moons that were left untouched, they found no trace of the Leonis. It was as if they had never existed. The Imperium had won. They had achieved their objective of cleansing the Xenos threat, but it felt hollow. There was no victory, only a profound and disturbing silence. The Lord Commander of the campaign, an Iron Hands captain named Valerius, stood on the observation deck of his battle barge. He looked out at the ghost system. He had fought Xenos for 2 centuries. He had seen their desperation, their rage, their cunning. He had never seen this. This was not the act of a cornered beast. It was the cold, deliberate act of a thinking mind. An act of sacrifice so total it defied all Imperial logic. Why? Why would a species with such power, such technology, choose to erase itself rather than fight? The question echoed in the silence, and there was no one left to answer. The investigation fell to the Inquisition. Ordo Xenos agents, accompanied by tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, began to sift through the digital ghosts left behind. They explored the less damaged outer moons and orbital stations that had survived the cataclysm. They found data fragments, damaged crystal engrams, and snippets of logs. It was a painstaking process, piecing together a puzzle from ashes. Slowly, horrifyingly, a picture began to form. A picture that turned the entire campaign on its head. The Inquisitors and priests worked in grim silence, their initial certainty replaced by a creeping dread. They found the archives, not the main libraries which had been vaporized, but backup data vaults hidden in deep space. Here, they uncovered the Leonis' history, the Great Vigil. They found records of deflected Orc fleets, of sabotaged Chaos incursions, of tyrannid vanguard organisms being hunted and destroyed on the fringes of Imperial space. The dates matched perfectly with Imperial records of near disasters that had mysteriously averted themselves. For thousands of years, the Leonis had been humanity's secret unsung protectors. They had fought and died for an Imperium that never even knew they existed. The final logs of High Elder Kalen were discovered in a hardened comms buoy that had been ejected moments before Leonis Prime's destruction. His voice, calm and sorrowful, explained their final decision. He spoke of the Great Vigil and the unwinnable war. He explained that to fight the Imperium would be to harm humanity, a violation of their most sacred oath. Therefore, they chose to remove themselves from the equation, to die by their own hand so that the Imperium's strength would not be wasted on them. It was not an act of surrender. It was their final act of guardianship, the ultimate sacrifice to protect humanity from itself. The truth spread like a shockwave through the upper echelons of the expeditionary force. The Space Marines, the Imperial Guard, the Navy Admirals. They had not been fighting monsters. They had been slaughtering their allies, their saviors. The guilt was a palpable thing. The Iron Hands, who prided themselves on logic and efficiency, were confronted with the ultimate tragic failure of their own rigid doctrine. They had been the instruments of a terrible injustice. The Xenos abominations were nobler than they were. The silence of the Leonis system was no longer a mystery. It was an accusation, a monument to the Imperium's blind, ignorant fury. The Leonis sector was declared prohibitus, forbidden. No ships were to enter, no records were to be made public. The official story was that a dangerous Xenos race had been purged, but had unleashed a strange stellar phenomenon in their death throes. The truth was buried. The Inquisition locked the data slates away in its deepest vaults, but the truth did not die. It lived on in the memories of those who had been there. The Space Marines who had seen the Blue Rain, the Admirals who had watched a world die, the Inquisitors who had read the final, heartbreaking words of the High Elder. The story became a legend, a ghost story told in the barracks of remote garrisons and the mess halls of void ships, a whispered tale of the Lion Warriors who died for the Emperor without ever meeting him. For the Iron Hands Captain Valerius, it became an obsession. He spent the rest of his long life studying the fragments of Leonis philosophy they had recovered. He saw in their great vigil a twisted reflection of his own chapter's cold logic, but tempered with a compassion his kind had lost. He saw a better way, a way that had been extinguished by his own hand. The memory haunted him, a silent rebuke for his chapter's pride. What if? The question lingered in the void. What if that first destroyer had not sent a distress call? What if the first Space Marines had tried to communicate instead of opening fire? An alliance between the Imperium and the Leonis could have changed the fate of the galaxy. Their wisdom and advanced technology, combined with the might of the Imperium, could have pushed back the darkness. They could have been a beacon of hope in a dying age, a friendship between the Lion of Terra's sons and the children of the First Roar. A golden age could have been born from understanding, but it was not to be. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war and ignorance. The Leonis are gone. Their worlds are ash and poison. Their legacy is a handful of forbidden files and a guilt that gnaws at the soul of a few old soldiers. They gave everything for humanity, including their own existence. Their final act was one of perfect, tragic, and utterly pointless sacrifice. They died to protect a friend who did not know they existed, and who, in their blind fear, had become their executioner. And the galaxy, uncaring, continued to burn.